The human condition, according to Ovid. If Homer is the poet of what we lose, Ovid is the poet of what we become. Writing at the height of Roman civilization and dying at its edge, exiled, cold, forgotten on the shore of the Black Sea, Publius Ovidius Naso produced a body of work that is dazzling, troubling, inexhaustible, and more contemporary in its concerns than almost anything written in the 2 millennia since. He understood that identity is not a fixed possession but a process, that desire remakes us whether we consent or not, and that the forces which transform us are indifferent to our preferences. His great poem is called the Metamorphoses. The title is also his philosophy. The first thing to understand about Ovid is that he is funny. Not funny in spite of his seriousness, but funny as a mode of seriousness. Wit deployed as a form of precision. Irony as a way of seeing clearly rather than looking away. He is the poet Rome produced when Rome was at its most comfortable and most anxious, when the Augustan settlement had turned the Republic into an empire and dressed the transformation in the language of restoration, when the official culture celebrated order and tradition, and the unofficial culture was busy with seduction, gossip, and the pleasures of a city that had never been richer or more distracted. Ovid was born in 43 BCE in Sulmo, a town in the Apennines, the year after Julius Caesar was assassinated. He came to Rome to study rhetoric, abandoned a legal career almost immediately, and became a poet, the most fashionable poet in the city, eventually the most famous writer in the world. His early work, the Amores, the Heroides, and the scandalous Ars Amatoria, made him the voice of a generation that took love seriously as a subject while treating it ironically as an experience. Then he wrote the Metamorphoses and the Fasti, and became something larger, not just a wit, but a mythographer, a cosmologist, a philosopher of change. And then, in 8 CE, the Emperor Augustus exiled him to Tomis, modern Constanta, on the Romanian coast of the Black Sea, for reasons that remain partially obscure. Ovid himself cited 2 causes, a poem and a mistake. The poem was the Ars Amatoria, which Augustus claimed was immoral. The mistake he never specified. He spent the remaining 10 years of his life in Tomis, writing the Tristia and the Epistulae ex Ponto, letters and laments addressed to his wife, his friends, the emperor himself, begging for recall or at least for mercy. He died in exile around 17 or 18 CE. He was never brought home. This biography matters more for Ovid than for almost any other ancient writer, because the life became, in the exile poems, part of the argument. The man who had written about transformation was himself transformed, stripped of the city that made him, reduced from the most celebrated poet in Rome to a cold, aging man on the edge of the known world, composing poems that nobody in power wanted to read. The irony is so perfectly Ovidian that one almost suspects him of having arranged it. The Metamorphoses opens with a statement of intent that is also a statement of cosmology. In nova fert animis mutatus dicere formis corpora, my mind leads me to speak of bodies changed into new forms. The poem will cover the history of the world from the original chaos to the death of Julius Caesar, a span of, roughly, everything, and the thread running through all of it is change. Nothing stays what it is. Gods become animals, humans become gods, women become trees and rivers and birds, men become women, and back again. The universe is a system not of stable essences, but of continuous transformation. This sounds at first like the premise of an entertaining anthology of myths. And the Metamorphoses is certainly that. Its 250 or so stories include some of the most vivid and influential narratives in Western literature: Daphne and Apollo, Narcissus and Echo, Actaeon and Diana, Persephone and Pluto, Orpheus and Eurydice, Pygmalion, Midas, Icarus, Medea. Ovid ransacked the Greek mythological tradition with the appetite and freedom of a writer who owned it, who felt entirely at liberty to reshape, invent, juxtapose, and undercut. His Medea is not Euripides' Medea. His Orpheus is not Virgil's. He takes what he needs and makes it new. But beneath the anthology, there is a sustained philosophical argument. Change, for Ovid, is not the enemy of identity, but its medium. We do not have selves that are then modified by experience. We are our modifications. The body, above all, is the site where this truth is most nakedly visible. It is what changes when desire takes hold, when age advances, when power is exercised upon us. The body is not the container of the self. It is the self's most honest expression, and it is always in the process of becoming something else. The story of Actaeon, the hunter who stumbles upon Diana bathing and is transformed into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds, is one of the most disturbing in the poem and one of the most philosophically precise. Actaeon has done nothing wrong. He did not seek the vision that destroyed him, and yet his punishment is absolute. Ovid pauses to note the injustice. Quid enim scilis adulit ipse e, quod vidit, crimen casu non fraud per est. What crime did he bring himself? What he saw was accomplished by chance, not by fraud. The goddess punishes him not for transgression, but for witnessing, for the mere fact of having been present at a sight not intended for him. What Actaeon's story tells us about the human condition is something deeply uncomfortable, that the forces which transform us are not moral forces. They do not punish the guilty and spare the innocent. They transform whoever's in their path. Actaeon becomes a stag not because stagness was inside him waiting to emerge, but because a goddess was startled and reached for the nearest instrument of punishment. The transformation is arbitrary, and it is absolute. He cannot speak. He cannot explain. His own dogs do not recognize him. He runs, and they follow, and he dies. The stag who was Actaeon is still Actaeon. He thinks as a man, suffers as a man, knows what is happening to him. But the body that carries his consciousness is no longer recognizable as his, and nobody he loved will be able to see past it. This is Ovid's version of a very ancient fear, that we might become unrecognizable to the people who love us, that the self we carry inside might have no purchase on the world if the form through which we express it changes beyond recovery. Ovid's gods are more dangerous than Homer's, and the reason is power. In Homer, the gods are unreliable allies, petty and magnificent by turns, but they exist in a kind of negotiated relationship with humanity even when they are tormenting it. In Ovid, the gods are desire without accountability, and their desires are overwhelmingly sexual, and the objects of those desires are almost always women. The Metamorphoses contains an extraordinary number of rapes. Apollo pursues Daphne. Jupiter rapes Io, Callisto, Europa, Semele, and Leda, among others. Neptune rapes Medusa. Pluto abducts Persephone. Tereus rapes and mutilates Philomela. The transformations that follow these violations, Daphne into a laurel tree, Io into a white heifer, Callisto into a bear, are framed within the narrative as divine acts. Sometimes rescues. Daphne's own father transforms her to save her. Sometimes punishments for the woman rather than the man. Callisto is turned into a bear by Juno, punishing her for having been raped by Juno's husband. The injustice is not hidden. It is rather the subject. This aspect of the Metamorphoses has been the center of fierce critical debate, particularly since the late 20th century. Is Ovid complicit in the violence he depicts? Is the wit that plays over these stories a form of aestheticization that diminishes the suffering? Or is the wit precisely the instrument through which Ovid marks the distance between himself and the divine perpetrators, making the injustice visible by refusing the solemnity that would normalize it? The poet and critic Anne Carson, writing in a different context, has noted that what the female figures in Greek myth tend to share is that they are made into metaphors for something else: the laurel for poetic achievement, the heifer for wandering, the bear for the wildness of nature. The woman is transformed into the symbol. Her individual experience is dissolved into the meaning she is made to carry. Ovid, it seems to me, is aware of exactly this dynamic and writes against it even while deploying it. His transformations preserve consciousness inside the new form. Daphne's heart is still beating under the bark. Io, as a heifer, tries to speak and finds herself lowing, and the sound horrifies her. Callisto, trapped inside a bear's body, is terrified of other bears because she is still a woman inside. The women do not become their metaphors. They remain themselves, changed and suffering inside the changed form. This does not redeem the violence, but it does mean that Ovid refuses the final cruelty of making it aesthetically tidy. The transformations do not bring peace. They bring a different kind of suffering, continuous and strange. The Ars Amatoria, the art of love, is the poem that got Ovid exiled, or at least provided Augustus with the excuse. It is a didactic poem in 3 books, the first 2 advising men on how to find and keep a lover, the third advising women on the same, and it is one of the funniest and most subversive works in Latin literature. It presents love as a craft, a set of techniques to be learned and applied. a game with rules that the practitioner can master through study and practice. This framing is itself a provocation. It refuses the sentimentality of love poetry, the Petrarchan posture of the helpless lover destroyed by beauty, and substitutes instead a cheerful, pragmatic, morally irresponsible guide to getting what you want. The subversion runs deep. By treating love as a skill rather than a fate, Ovid implicitly undermines the Roman ideology of passion as something that happens to you, that excuses your behavior, that grants the lover a special exemption from ordinary moral accountability. In the Ars Amatoria, nobody is helpless. The lover is a strategist, the beloved a quarry, and the whole business is conducted with the lucid self-awareness of someone who understands that what they are doing is a performance. Even or especially, the emotions are, to some extent, performed. Ovid advises his readers to cry at the right moment, to flatter convincingly, to appear more devoted than they may feel. This could be read as cynicism, and many have read it that way. But there is something more interesting going on. Ovid is not saying that love is not real. He is saying that the conventions through which love is expressed are constructions, that the roles of passionate lover and resistant beloved are roles, and that recognizing them as roles does not diminish the experience, but liberates you to engage with it more intelligently and more honestly. The mask, he suggests, is not opposed to the face beneath it. Sometimes it is the face, or the best version of it. The heroids, letters from mythological heroines to their absent lovers, take this interest in performance and interiority to its logical extreme. Penelope writes to Odysseus, Dido writes to Aeneas, Medea writes to Jason. These are women whose stories we know from other sources, transformed by Ovid into first-person voices, and what is remarkable about them is not their eloquence but their specificity, the way each woman argues from her own position, her own grievance, her own understanding of what has been done to her. Dido is furious and precise. Medea is frightening in her controlled, lawyerly exposition of Jason's betrayal. Penelope is patient and tired and beginning, very quietly, to run out of patience. These are not passive victims. They are intelligences trapped in situations not of their making, using the only instrument available to them, language, to make their cases to men who have already left. The letters will not be answered. The form guarantees it. But Ovid gives the women their say in full, and what they say is devastating. And then there is Narcissus. No figure in the Metamorphoses has proved more durable as a cultural touchstone, and no story has been more systematically misread. Narcissus is not in Ovid's telling. A vain young man in love with his own beauty. He is a young man who falls in love with the reflection he does not recognize as his own. Quod petis et nusquam. Ovid writes, what you are seeking is nowhere, and who is destroyed not by self-love, but by the impossibility of possessing what he loves. The cruelty of his punishment is that he is not trapped by vanity, but by ignorance. He does not know the face in the water is his own until it is too late. Echo, the nymph cursed to repeat only what she hears, is his mirror in another sense. She can express nothing original, only return what she is given. Together they form an image of communication destroyed, the person who can say nothing new, the person who cannot receive what he sees. Their story is, among other things, a story about the impossibility of genuine reciprocity, about the ways in which we reach for connection and find only our own projections return to us. What Ovid does with Narcissus that nobody else has quite managed is to make the tragedy simultaneously pathetic and philosophically serious. The boy is ridiculous, beautiful, doomed by the gap between the image and the reality, between desire and its object. And yet the gap he falls into is the same gap that opens in every love affair, every moment of longing, every attempt to hold something that cannot be held. Narcissus is an extreme case of the ordinary human experience of wanting. The exile poems are the hardest part of Ovid to read, and they are often the least read, and they are, I think, essential. The Tristia and the Epistulae ex Ponto, the Sorrows and the Letters from the Black Sea, were written in Thomis during the last decade of Ovid's life, and they are the work of a man who has been, in the deepest sense, transformed. The poet of Metamorphoses is now the object of metamorphosis. The city that made him is gone. The language he writes in is foreign to the people around him. He is cold, aging ill. He is afraid of the local tribes and afraid of dying before he is recalled, and afraid that his poetry is getting worse because he has nobody to talk to. The tonal shift from the early work is enormous. and critics have sometimes found the exile poems uncomfortable to praise. They are often repetitive, occasionally pathetic, and their relentless supplications to Augustus and Tiberius sit uneasily with the irony and independence of the earlier work. But that discomfort is, I would argue, part of what makes them essential. Ovid, the master ironist, stripped of the conditions that made irony possible, discovers that he cannot maintain the pose. The Tristia are not polished performances. They are the work of a man in genuine distress, trying to hold himself together through the act of writing. In the first book of the Tristia, Ovid describes the night of his exile, the sudden departure, the wife weeping, the friends unable to speak. He had a statue of Augustus in his house, he says, and when he looked at it on the night he had to leave, he could not bring himself to say farewell. The image is almost unbearably poignant, the man exiled by the emperor's power, unable to say goodbye to the emperor's face, power and the helplessness before it, crystallized in a single moment. What the exile poems add to the Metamorphoses is biography, the confirmation that the philosophical argument about transformation was not abstract, that Ovid knew from experience what it meant to be changed beyond recognition by forces outside your control. The writer who had charted the transformations of Actaeon and Io and Callisto was himself transformed, stripped of the context that made him himself, left in a foreign place where nobody could see him as what he had been. Whether this was Augustus' intention to metamorphose the poet of Metamorphoses, it is exactly what happened, and yet the poems kept coming. This is the final thing to say about Ovid, and perhaps the most important: he kept writing. In Thomas, in the cold, in Latin to people who spoke a dialect of Getic and Sarmatian, without an audience, without a library, without the city of Rome that had been the air he breathed, he kept writing. He sent poems back to Rome knowing they might not be read. He revised his own earlier works in exile, adding prologues, adjusting arguments. He wrote the Fasti, a verse calendar of Roman religious observances, from memory. He was a writer in the way that some people are Catholic or Republican, not as a choice but as a condition, an orientation toward the world that persisted regardless of circumstances. This persistence is its own argument about the human condition. What survives transformation, Ovid's life suggests, is not the form, not the city, the fame, the wit, the social context, but the impulse to make meaning out of experience, to take what has happened and find words for it, to refuse the silence that exile and suffering and power try to impose. The man who wrote about bodies changed into new forms found that the mind, at least, retained its shape. He wrote himself back into existence, poem by poem, in the cold. Ovid is not, in the end, a comforting writer. He does not promise that the transformations we undergo will be for the better, or that the forces that change us are just, or that the self survives its metamorphoses intact. He promises something more honest, that change is the condition of existence, not its interruption, that what we are is not what we were and not yet what we will be, that the gap between the image and the reality is where all the interesting suffering lives, and that the proper response to this, the only response that preserves the intelligence and the dignity, is to look at it clearly, with irony when irony is available and without it when it is not. He is also, incidentally, the reason that the Western tradition has the myths it has. The Metamorphoses was the primary source through which medieval and Renaissance Europe encountered the stories of the Greeks. Dante puts Ovid among the great poets of antiquity in the Inferno Shakespeare read him at school. Milton saturated himself in him. Titian, Velázquez, Bernini, Turner, the list of artists formed by the Metamorphoses is effectively the list of Western art. To read Ovid is to read the book that made the visual imagination of Europe. But the legacy, finally, is less important than the poems themselves, which are stranger and darker and funnier than their cultural influence suggests. The Metamorphoses is not a treasury of classical mythology politely arranged for the edification of later ages. It is a sustained, restless, brilliant argument about the instability of everything: bodies, identities, power, love, the stories we tell about ourselves. It begins with chaos. It ends with Caesar's apotheosis and a promise by Ovid that his own name, his own work, will survive. Given that we are still reading him 2,000 years later, in a world he could not have imagined, we might grant him that. The rest is transformation.